The avoidant attachment style operates through a layered system of unconscious fantasies that quietly shape who they feel drawn to, even when they are not aware of it. These internal images influence their attraction and desire in ways that often contradict what they consciously say they want. By understanding these hidden psychological patterns, it becomes possible to interact with them in a way that naturally increases emotional pull and interest. These fantasies are rooted in early emotional wounds and unmet needs, which create triggers that can bypass their usual defensive responses when activated in the right way. What makes this dynamic complex is that avoidants often believe they want distance, independence, and emotional separation. Yet beneath that surface, their deeper fantasies revolve around finding a person who feels safe, steady, and accepting without overwhelming them. The person who unknowingly aligns with these inner fantasies often becomes extremely compelling to them. For avoidants, the first and strongest fantasy is an emotionally self-sufficient partner who does not rely on them for validation, stability, or a sense of identity. This desire comes from their deep fear of becoming emotionally responsible for another person and being overwhelmed by dependency. When they meet someone who appears genuinely independent, it creates a powerful sense of attraction because it suggests connection without emotional pressure or caretaking demands. To activate this response, a person must show real emotional stability that does not rise or fall based on the avoidant's behavior. Their mood, confidence, and sense of self remain steady, whether the avoidant is close or distant. This kind of consistency feels safe and compelling to them. However, this cannot be faked because avoidants are highly sensitive to inauthentic independence. They quickly notice when strength is performed for approval rather than genuinely embodied. Only real emotional maturity creates the pull, because only authenticity removes their sense of threat. Authenticity is what makes it safe. The second major fantasy for avoidance is the mysterious and slightly unpredictable partner who cannot be easily understood or fully controlled. This kind of dynamic excites their mind because it offers ongoing stimulation and a sense of depth that matches their own internal complexity. When someone is too predictable or reveals everything about themselves too quickly, the avoidant tends to lose interest because the sense of discovery disappears. To embody this fantasy, a person needs to maintain genuine depth, not by pretending or playing roles, but by having a rich inner world, personal interests, and emotional layers that unfold gradually over time. They should not feel fully accessible at first meeting, but instead feel like someone who continues to reveal new aspects of themselves. This includes having boundaries, private spaces, and a life that does not immediately revolve around the avoidant's presence. It also involves having their own direction, opinions, and choices, even when they differ from what the avoidant prefers, including their own direction and choices. They're drawn to people who can challenge them both intellectually and emotionally, but without becoming aggressive, needy, or emotionally demanding. That balance matters a lot. If someone comes across as too confrontational, it feels unsafe and pushes them away. But if there is no depth or challenge at all, the connection feels flat and uninteresting. What tends to hold their attention is someone who can stand their ground, think independently, and engage them in a way that keeps their mind active without turning the dynamic into pressure or emotional conflict. Another layer of this fantasy is the idea of earning affection rather than receiving it too easily. There is often suspicion toward people who are immediately available, overly enthusiastic, or too quick to invest. On a subconscious level, that kind of ease can be interpreted as lack of value or desperation. In contrast, when connection takes some effort, when attention is not instantly guaranteed, it feels more real and more meaningful to them. The sense of having to show up, prove themselves, or gradually unlock someone's interest creates a stronger emotional investment than effortless access ever could. The third fantasy is what can be called the non-judgmental witness. Deep down, many avoidants carry a quiet hope that someone will be able to see past their defenses without trying to correct or change them. They don't just want to be understood on a surface level. They want someone who can recognize the reasons behind their distance and not turn it into a personal attack or a problem to fix. Instead of reacting to withdrawal with pressure or emotional escalation, what feels safest is someone who can simply acknowledge it with calm acceptance, something like understanding that space is part of how they regulate themselves, and still remaining emotionally present without chasing or withdrawing in return. This kind of presence also extends into how affection is noticed. Avoidants often don't express care in obvious or traditional ways, but through actions, consistency, or small details. A person who can recognize those quieter forms of expression without demanding constant verbal reassurance becomes emotionally significant to them. Just as important is the ability to hold a steady, non-critical view of who they are. Instead of focusing on what they lack in emotional expression, the emphasis shifts toward what they naturally do well, like independence, control, and composure. When someone sees those traits as strengths rather than flaws, it reduces internal defensiveness. At a deeper level, there is also a desire to be seen as fundamentally good, even if their way of relating doesn't fit typical emotional expectations. Being understood in that way creates a rare sense of emotional safety. The fourth fantasy is the secure base. This is the idea of having someone stable, reliable, and emotionally steady, who does not collapse into panic or demands when distance appears. Many avoidants learned early on that emotional closeness can feel overwhelming or unsafe, so they develop a strong need for predictability in relationships. What feels comforting is a person who remains consistent, even when the avoidant pulls back, without turning that space into punishment, guilt, or emotional escalation. Instead of pressure, there is patience. Instead of urgency, there is calm availability. This secure base also includes emotional and practical reliability. When someone follows through on what they say, stays grounded in their behavior, and doesn't create unnecessary chaos, it builds trust over time. It signals that the relationship won't become emotionally destabilizing or demanding in unpredictable ways. Because of this, the avoidant can slowly lower their guard, not all at once, but in small increments that feel manageable. They don't want to feel rushed into intimacy. They want the option to move closer at their own pace, without fear of punishment for stepping back when needed. The sixth fantasy is the adventure companion. Avoidants are often drawn to people who share a genuine love for novelty, exploration, and new experiences, but without turning every moment into an emotional discussion or constant relational analysis. What appeals to them is a partner who can simply enjoy life alongside them, whether that means traveling, learning something new, engaging in intellectual interests, or growing personally, without making every shared experience about bonding, reassurance, or emotional processing. The connection feels strongest when experiences remain light, engaging, and forward-moving, rather than emotionally heavy or overly introspective in the moment. To embody this, a person needs to have a real inner drive for exploration that exists independently of the relationship. This isn't about acting adventurous for attention, but about actually living a life filled with curiosity, hobbies, skill building, and personal discovery. That independent momentum is what creates attraction, because it shows that growth is not dependent on the avoidant's presence or validation. Alongside that, there is a strong preference for ease in shared experiences. Avoidants tend to respond well to people who can simply be present, enjoy the moment, and not require constant emotional checking or validation while doing things together. They are also drawn to companions who bring their own energy into the dynamic. Instead of always following the avoidant's lead or relying on them to create experiences, the idealized partner contributes ideas, suggests plans, and introduces new perspectives. This creates a sense of shared expansion rather than emotional dependency. The relationship becomes less about filling emotional gaps and more about mutual exploration, where both people bring something fresh into each other's world without pressure or expectation of constant closeness. The final layer is the implementation strategy, and this is where many misunderstand the entire idea. None of this works when it is performed as a strategy or used as a form of manipulation. Avoidants are usually highly sensitive to inauthentic behavior, and they can pick up when someone is acting out a role to achieve a reaction. What actually creates connection is genuine personal development. These qualities only become attractive when they are real and lived, not staged. Emotional self-sufficiency, curiosity, stability, acceptance, independence, and adventurousness are not techniques. They are traits that develop through real-life experience and inner growth. Timing and consistency matter just as much as presence. These qualities should not be revealed in dramatic moments or packaged as something to impress. Instead, they are noticed slowly over time through steady behavior. The avoidant needs space to observe whether these traits hold up under different emotional conditions, especially during distance, silence, or uncertainty. If they remain stable even when the dynamic shifts, trust begins to form naturally. At its core, this approach is not about learning how to win someone, but about becoming a more grounded and self-directed person. The same traits that may resonate with an avoidant also improve every other area of life and every other type of relationship. Emotional regulation, independence, depth, acceptance, stability, equality, and curiosity are not just attractive qualities, they are foundational to healthy connection in general. When someone genuinely develops in this direction, they don't just become appealing to one attachment style, they become capable of building relationships that are stable, respectful, and emotionally real. What I'm really describing underneath all of these fantasies is not a set of tricks that make someone pursue harder, but a predictable attachment pattern. Avoidance is pulled toward what feels safe enough, not to overwhelm them, but stimulating enough not to feel emotionally dead. That tension is where their interest tends to sit. Too much emotional intensity too soon feels like pressure or loss of control. Too much emotional distance feels like disconnection and boredom. So their attraction often moves toward people who can hold that middle space without collapsing into neediness or chasing. One thing that often gets misunderstood is the idea of earning affection. It's not actually about making someone work for love in a strategic sense. It's more about how the avoidant nervous system interprets access and availability. If connection feels too instantly guaranteed, it can trigger suspicion rather than comfort. Not because availability is bad, but because for them it can unconsciously resemble emotional engulfment or lack of boundaries. On the other hand, when someone has a stable sense of self and doesn't overinvest prematurely, the avoidant system registers less threat, which creates more openness over time. The key difference is not playing hard to get, but not abandoning yourself in the process of getting close. Another deeper layer is that avoidants often don't trust intensity that isn't grounded. They may be drawn in by emotional expressiveness, but sustained closeness depends on consistency, predictability, and non-reactivity. If someone changes tone, energy, or emotional state based on the avoidance distance, it can reinforce their belief that closeness leads to instability or responsibility they don't want. But when a person remains emotionally centered regardless of proximity, it disrupts that old expectation. It doesn't force them to commit, but it reduces the perceived risk of connection. There is also an important distinction between independence and emotional disconnection. Healthy attraction for avoidance is not about coldness or emotional unavailability. It's about someone who can stay connected without becoming emotionally entangled in a way that feels consuming. That means they can share experiences, intimacy, and affection, but still maintain their own identity, friendships, interests, and internal world. Ironically, this often creates more genuine closeness, because nothing feels like it is collapsing into dependency. Over time, what actually tends to soften avoidance is not intensity, but safety that repeats itself. A person who doesn't punish distance, doesn't chase panic, doesn't turn every withdrawal into a crisis, and doesn't lose their center when the other pulls away, creates a different kind of relational experience. It becomes less about escape and more about choice. And that shift from I have to get away to I can stay and still be myself is usually where deeper connection starts to become possible. But there's an important boundary in all of this that often gets missed when people focus too much on activation. These dynamics are not something you can control into a stable relationship. You can't permanently bypass someone's attachment system by embodying the right traits. At most, you can create conditions where connection feels safer and more sustainable. Whether the other person is actually willing and capable of meeting you, there is a separate variable entirely. The most stable outcome always comes when both people are doing the internal work. One person regulating themselves and the other learning to tolerate intimacy instead of reflexively stepping away. If only one side is adapting, the dynamic eventually becomes imbalanced. That's why the qualities discussed, emotional steadiness, independence, curiosity, boundaries, work best when they are not aimed at producing a reaction, but built as a foundation for your own life. When that's the case, relationships become less about managing anxiety and more about genuine compatibility, where closeness is chosen rather than chased or avoided. Another important layer is how avoidance often confuses calmness with lack of need and intensity with emotional danger. So when someone is emotionally regulated, not reactive, and not constantly seeking reassurance, the avoidance system often reads that as safe distance, even if the connection is meaningful. This is where people sometimes misinterpret the dynamic and think they are supposed to stay detached or emotionally muted. In reality, it's not about suppressing emotion. It's about not being ruled by it in a way that creates pressure for the other person. At the same time, avoidants are not actually looking for emptiness or emotional absence. That's a common misunderstanding. What tends to draw them in is emotional presence that doesn't demand immediate reciprocation. They can feel closeness more comfortably when it arrives without urgency. If affection comes with expectations like constant reassurance, fast commitment, or immediate emotional matching, it can feel overwhelming. But if it is expressed and then allowed to breathe, they often engage more freely over time. There is also a subtle internal conflict many avoidants carry. They want connection, but they distrust the loss of autonomy that they associate with it. So they are often scanning for signs that a relationship will eventually cost them their independence. This is why consistency without pressure is so influential. When someone proves over time that closeness does not automatically lead to control, obligation, or emotional flooding, it slowly rewires that expectation. It doesn't remove the avoidance, but it can reduce the urgency of withdrawal. Another aspect worth understanding is that avoidants often bond more through shared experience than through emotional disclosure. While other attachment styles may build closeness primarily through talking, avoidants can feel connection more strongly through doing, traveling, solving problems, sharing activities, building something together. Emotional conversations still matter, but they land better when there is already a foundation of shared, low-pressure experience. Without that foundation, emotional depth can feel like too much too soon. It's also important to see how inconsistency from the other person can unintentionally reinforce avoidance. If someone becomes anxious, over-invested, or unpredictable in their emotional responses, it confirms the avoidance internal model that closeness equals instability. But when the other person remains steady, even in moments of distance, it creates a different reference point. The avoidant begins to experience that connection does not automatically spiral into chaos, which is what allows them to stay present a little longer each time. Over time, what actually builds trust is not intensity, but emotional reliability combined with space. Not chasing, not withdrawing in protest, not turning distance into punishment, but also not disappearing emotionally. Just a steady presence that doesn't force resolution before the system is ready for it. That balance is rare, which is why it feels impactful when it appears. And beneath all of this, there's a quieter truth. Avoidants don't just fear being needed too much. They also fear not being enough in a way they can't fix. So when someone approaches them with calm self-possession and emotional clarity, it removes both pressures at once. They are not being demanded to save someone, and they are not being evaluated as inadequate. That combination is what creates the first real sense of relational safety for them. Another layer that often goes unnoticed is how avoidants interpret emotional silence. For many people, silence feels like distance or disconnection that needs to be immediately repaired. But for avoidants, silence can feel regulating, even necessary. It gives them space to process without feeling emotionally pursued. When someone can tolerate that silence without filling it with anxiety-driven messages, explanations, or pressure for clarity, it changes the emotional atmosphere of the connection. The absence of reaction becomes non-threatening rather than charged. At the same time, silence only feels safe when the overall connection still exists in a stable form. If silence is paired with inconsistency, unpredictability, or emotional volatility, it doesn't feel calming at all. It starts to feel like abandonment or instability. So what matters is not silence itself, but the emotional tone surrounding it. A steady connection that doesn't collapse under distance is what allows avoidants to remain engaged rather than retreat further. Another important dynamic is how avoidants often test emotional safety indirectly. They rarely ask for reassurance directly. Instead, they may withdraw, delay responses, or reduce emotional expression to observe what happens next. They are not always consciously aware of doing this. It's more of a protective reflex. They are essentially checking whether closeness will turn into pressure, criticism, or emotional demand. The response they receive in those moments often shapes the trajectory of the relationship more than the good moments do. This is also where many relationships unintentionally break down. If the other person reacts to withdrawal with panic, pursuit, or emotional escalation, it confirms the avoidance expectation that intimacy becomes overwhelming. But if the response is grounded, calm, and non-punitive, it introduces a different possibility. That distance does not automatically damage connection. That realization is what slowly softens the reflex to withdraw. There is also a deeper emotional contradiction inside many avoidants. They often long for closeness that feels effortless, but their nervous system is calibrated to associate effort with risk. So when connection feels too smooth or too fast, they may distrust it, and when it feels too demanding, they retreat. What holds their attention longer is a rhythm that neither overwhelms nor disappears, a kind of emotional pacing that allows trust to build gradually, instead of forcing immediate certainty. Over time, what actually creates stability is not the elimination of withdrawal, but the removal of threat around it. When withdrawal is no longer met with punishment, protest, or emotional collapse, it loses some of its defensive function. It becomes less about escape and more about regulation. And when that shift happens, the avoidant begins to experience something new, proximity that doesn't cost them their sense of self. But even then, nothing becomes guaranteed, because attachment patterns are not just relational, they are deeply internal. The most a partner can do is create a consistent emotional environment where closeness is not dangerous and distance is not catastrophic. Whether the avoidant learns to stay in that space more fully depends on their own capacity to tolerate intimacy, not just the behavior of the other person. When you look at all of these dynamics together, a clearer picture emerges than any single fantasy on its own. What is often labeled as attraction patterns in avoidant attachment is really a negotiation between two competing internal needs, the desire for connection and the need for self-protection. These two forces are always running at the same time, and whichever one feels more threatened in the moment tends to take control of behavior. This is why consistency, emotional steadiness, and non-reactivity show up repeatedly across all the patterns. Not because they are techniques to secure someone's attention, but because they reduce perceived threat. For an avoidant nervous system, threat is not only about danger in the obvious sense, but also about emotional overwhelm, loss of autonomy, or being pulled into responsibility they feel unprepared to hold. When those signals decrease, connection becomes less activating in a defensive way and more available in a genuine way. At the same time, there is a common misunderstanding that if you simply embody enough secure traits, the avoidant will automatically open up and stay. Realistically, that is not how attachment works. You can create a healthier relational environment, but you cannot replace someone's internal readiness for intimacy. If a person has not developed enough capacity to tolerate closeness, they will eventually reach their limit, regardless of how safe the environment is. That is an internal threshold, not just a relational one. What does tend to change over time, when change is possible, is not the absence of avoidance, but the meaning of closeness. In the beginning, closeness may feel like pressure, expectation, or potential loss of self. With enough steady, non-punitive experiences, it can slowly begin to register as something more neutral, and sometimes even supportive. Distance becomes less charged, reconnection becomes easier. Emotional presence stops feeling like a trap and starts feeling like a choice. But the most important shift is not about the avoidant alone, it is about the other person as well. The qualities that are often discussed in these contexts, emotional self-regulation, independence, curiosity, boundaries, and stability, are not just ways of relating to an avoidant partner. They are foundational traits of emotional maturity in any relationship. When someone develops them deeply, their entire relational life changes, not just one specific attachment dynamic. They stop building relationships from anxiety, urgency, or fear of loss, and start building them from clarity and self-possession. And that is where the real conclusion sits. The healthiest outcome is never about figuring out how to make a specific attachment style respond in a predictable way. It is about becoming someone who is internally grounded enough that connection does not require self-abandonment. If the other person is able to meet that level of presence, then a relationship can grow that feels steady, mutual, and real. If they cannot, that mismatch becomes visible earlier, without prolonged confusion or emotional depletion. In the end, what looks like understanding avoidant fantasies is really a mirror for understanding relational safety. What feels attractive is what feels safe. What feels overwhelming is what feels threatening. And what lasts is not what is most intense at the beginning, but what can remain steady without either person losing themselves in the process.